Do you like scary movies? Hi, my name is Marko and welcome to another episode of Storyline Sessions podcast. It's the spooky season, so I think it's appropriate to get into some spooky talks. Fantasy author and YouTuber Andrew Watson, who you'll have an opportunity to see on this channel very soon, recently put out a video with an interesting premise. He gathered a bunch of creators from the booktube space and had them each recommend a spooky read for the Halloween season. It was interesting seeing what everybody came up with, and I'll leave the link in the description so you can find out for yourself, but this also made me wonder about how we treat horror and how it mixes with other genres. For me, it's always interesting seeing how people who aren't usually that into horror react to it, and how they seek out recommendations, and how they get closer to it with each spooky season. I also started watching the Fall of the House of Usher limited series. Of course it has horror elements, but I agree with a lot of people online who noted it's basically Succession with some horror themes and Edgar Allan Poe Easter eggs sprinkled in. This isn't meant as a critique, but rather a starting point for me to talk about the overlap of horror and other types of stories, our relationship to it, and the appeal that it obviously has. I think it's appropriate to start with the dark appeal that fairy tales have. I recently wrote about the Fables comics on my Instagram, but even without the adaptations, I believe that a lot of original stories were pretty dark, and a lot of movie studios actually adapted them and made them more suitable for kids later on. But I think there's a middle ground that embraces the macabre spirit a lot of fairy tales have. There are a couple of authors that come to mind when I think about this sub-genre. Neil Gaiman has at least a dash of horror in basically all of his work, but it's at a level where almost anybody could still enjoy his stories without being freaked out. There's a specter in his work. On one side you have things such as Coraline and the Graveyard Book, and on the other there are works such as Neverwhere, American Gods, and even Sandman. The more dark moments in there complement the other themes perfectly, and I think there's another important author in that space that matches a similar feel. It's Guillermo del Toro. His Pan's Labyrinth is an ideal model of the thing I'm describing. He sometimes goes into full-blown horror with things such as the anthology that is the Cabinet of Curiosities, but more often he's balancing between magic realism and gothic. Moving in kind of a chronological order, there are some classic authors who aren't considered strictly horror, or some of them aren't at all, but they included some dark themes and undertones in their work, so it won't be a mistake to put them on a spooky season shelf. The first one is Edgar Allan Poe, who I mentioned before. He of course doesn't need a special introduction, but between his poems and even his detective stories, he basically had a constant Halloween tone to him. But there's also Mary Shelley, who established a strong connection between sci-fi, which she was one of the founders of, and horror. And on a similar note, there's H.G. Wells, whose stories, such as The Island of Dr. Moreau, still hold up with some of the modern heavy hitters even today. I'd like to round this part off with Robert Louis Stevenson, who is also rarely mentioned in the same breath as some of the other authors, as he created a lot of work catered to a younger audience. Still, I believe that The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde can be considered as an inspiration for a lot of modern creepy stuff. I'll use the mention of the work created with a younger audience in mind as a segue to the next chapter where I'll talk about the more modern stories. In the 2000s and 2010s we had a wave of young adult fiction that used horror tropes such as vampires and zombies as basically window dressing for their romance stories. We still get those, of course, but I feel like we passed the heyday with things such as The Mortal Instruments and, of course, the Twilight Saga. And even The Maze Runner had some bits of horror in it. The sci-fi heritage also split into few paths. I believe this is a genre that naturally bonds with horror thanks to its exploration of the unknown, and there are many scary stories that lend themselves well to a futuristic setting. There are some obvious picks, like the Alien franchise and The Thing, but also some more subtle ones, like The Arrival, which delves into existential themes. There's also stuff in between, such as the Southern Reach trilogy or Annihilation in film, which holds the creepy and uncanny factor, but also has a broader audience that's not necessarily that tied into horror. As I think more about this subject, I was actually surprised by the number of examples of horror seeping into other types of stories in media. Sidestepping into fantasy, as we saw in Andrew's video that I mentioned in the beginning, there's a bunch of overlap. Fantasy, urban fantasy, and all kinds of subgenres that deal with supernatural have a connection with horror that's driving some of their most memorable moments. George Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones series relies on a dark force to push the elements of the plot forward, and in some ways and in some moments this borders on something we'd see in some serious zombie apocalypse movie. I think that The Witcher also has many moments with themes and monsters who could fit into their own scary stories easily if just framed a bit more differently. Even Harry Potter, which I'm still thinking about rereading, has some seriously chilling moments with the Dementors and the Death Eaters that became more prominent with each new sequel as the audience grew. We've also seen comedy and horror work so well together done with understanding of both sides, and examples such as Shaun of the Dead and more recently Get Out and Us show us that audiences can respond well to this mix. The comedy and the personal drama makes it more palatable for an audience that usually doesn't deal with horror, and the horror appeal helps the core message reach a whole new audience that usually wouldn't gravitate towards the author's work. But I think that also shows that treating horror as a genre only focused on getting scares, and therefore a genre less valuable than others, is fundamentally flawed. The universal themes that horror usually tackles, such as fear, mortality, unknown, and even love, can build a strong foundation for blending of the genres, and they can also help prop up the emotional moments in any kind of media and stories. Horror can be found in strange places, from musicals like Sweeney Todd to The Simpsons that embrace it in their annual Treehouse of Horror specials, which I love. There's another point I'd like to make that showed itself while I was thinking about this, and that's there's a key difference between being spooky and truly scary, and if you manage to walk that line with understanding, that's the winning combination for a lot of people. Horror is a genre known for polarizing audiences, but some people who don't enjoy the traditional horror content find themselves drawn to its elements in unexpected places. That's why horror in disguise works. Horror elements can be sprinkled throughout to add some underlying tension, mystery, and unease that you wouldn't have without it. In a more controlled setting, these elements offer an adrenaline rush and a chance to explore the boundaries and comfort zones of your audience. It's not just about scaring your audience. The inclusion of spooky elements into media that's typically unrelated to horror offers a unique and exciting change of pace. It also allows audiences to explore their fears and anxieties in a way that's ultimately entertaining and often relieving, with just getting a taste of something different without going too far. We've seen some examples of that recently with movies such as Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. On an even lighter side, the Sims series offers Spooky Stuff expansion pack with horror-themed content, and even Stardew Valley has Halloween-themed event with spooky decor and activities. As I'm sure you're well aware by now, I'm a huge horror fan, but I'm not into gatekeeping the genre, and I generally don't like strictly splitting things based on it. I just want to shed some light on it and maybe point out to some of you that it's not all so scary. I'm interested in hearing your takes on it. Do you participate in the spooky season? What's your go-to media? Let me know in the comments. As I teased in the beginning, there's an interview with Andrew Watson coming your way next week, and plenty of interesting stuff about creative writing and storytelling yet to come. So feel free to stick around and follow Storyline Sessions on Instagram as well. My name is Marko Bogdanović, and I'll see you next time. Keep creating spooky stories.